Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
We are in London, and today we interview Edmund de Waal because after his very famous best-selling book, The Hair with Amber Eyes, he now published Shutter Windows, a new book, Letters to Camondo. We are going to interview Edmund de Waal, who we know well, and who is also, as many people know, very well-renowned and famous artist, specialist in pottery, and who has exposed his work in various important places, from the ghetto of Venice to New York and so on and so forth, and had various exhibitions. But today we're going to focus our interview on this new book, Letters to Camondo, because it has a lot to say about. And if you want, we can start with the last chapter of the book, where you somehow explain in a short kind of autobiography who you are. And there's reference to a sentence that has been pronounced in French, which is "Ce que nous sommes," what are we? I don't know how is the exact translation in English. You explain your strange destiny. My father is a half-Jewish Anglican clergyman. My mother is the daughter of a country vicar, a historian, writer on monasticism, and I've been brought up in the Church of England in cathedrals. I have written about Quakers and am drawn to their silences. I read Zen Buddhist poetry. I love the psalm, and they cross over everything, are proper poems of exile. I'm half English and a quarter Dutch and a quarter Austrian and completely European. Ce que nous sommes, you are a complete European, right?
Yes.
And then you talk about your father who was based in Paris, Vienna, Tyrol, and then came to England. This is the conclusion of your new book, Letters to Camondo. Maybe you should explain who the Camondo are and how they were somehow linked to the Ephrussi, your original family. You came from Odessa to Vienna, the Camondo came to Istanbul, to Paris.
So in some ways, the story is one of assimilation. The story is absolutely one of where do you begin and where do you choose to go? And when you go to the place you've chosen, what have you brought with you and how do you assimilate? How do you become a new person in a new country? And it's this for the Camondo, it's from, as you say, from a Jewish family, Istanbul to Paris. They become part of Jewish Belle Epoque society. My own family, the Ephrussi from Odessa, they go to Vienna, they go to Paris, they become perfect Viennese, they become perfect Parisians. And everyone intermarries, everyone's a cousin. That's one of the nightmare complexities of these kinds of stories. But at the heart of it is this story of leaving somewhere and settling somewhere else. And then there's the story of what assimilation actually means. So who are you trying to become? Who are you trying to be? And also the forces against that. Who is trying to tell you that you don't belong? And of course, in the last century, my father's generation, that's been completely present in the moment of the Anschluss in Vienna, that whole irrevocable destruction of Jewish Vienna. And then with the Camondo family, who are also cousins, this extraordinary, painful moment when this perfect Parisian family is turned inside out and the children are deported and grandchildren are taken to Drancy and deported to Auschwitz, this Parisian family.
Your book about assimilation, about people who come from elsewhere and then try to become whatever other place they have chosen, be applied even today to any kind of people, right? People who come from any religion or any country, and for instance, in England or in France today, The only difference that your book starts with ascending, growing up in society, and then being completely, apparently assimilated. And then it ends with the horrible genocide, right? That was against the Jews and probably is not completely against anyone else nowadays. What is your suggestion? People who come from other countries, should they be careful? Should they not try to assimilate so much?
It's a really interesting and uncomplicated question. But what I try and trace is the language that's used around assimilation in France. So I trace it back before the Dreyfus Affair, deep into the 19th century, and how that language of anti-Semitism, the language of Drummond, this language of talking about how only some kinds of people are authentically French and how other kinds of people, in our family's cases Jewish, the Jewish communities, are poisoning or polluting Frenchness. So it's that kind of language which ends up horrifically in the Shoah. That language ends up at Drancy. Now, what I'm trying to tease out in this book, in a parallel way, in some ways, overlapping way that I did in The Hair with Amber Eyes, is for myself, what does that mean about identity? Where do I fit in this story of belonging? And of course, that makes me look out to the other communities, refugee communities and exile communities in this country. Of course it does. And, I work with refugee groups and I have a strong, passionate interest in supporting refugees and asylum seekers here because I see parallels with my father's story. I really do. But it all comes, for me, it comes as a writer, and this is really important. It comes down to tuning into language. It comes to tuning in to the particular accretion of language around otherness, around telling people that they do not belong or that they are not worthy of being in this country.
This sense of French purity existed, of course, in the writings of Drummond. And you quote in the book the writings of Drummond, the writings of Céline. The other side, you quote two Jewish writers, which are Proust and Walter Benjamin. There is a paradox in that during the 30s, for the first time in France, there is Léon Blum, a French prime minister. Yeah. There are still writers like Renaud Camus, for instance, who write books about the French belonging and the purity of the French. This feeling, this double France, which is against Dreyfus or for Dreyfus, still exists.
Isn't that true? I mean, there is this extraordinary, painful fracture still, and it's a fracture between deep France and metropolitan France in some way, but it's almost deeper than that. It's not just that polarity, is it? There's also a strange feeling, a strange anxiety, I suppose, around Proust, because Proust is beatified, but throughout his books, he is absolutely trying to navigate belonging in society, amongst many other things. And that still is painfully true.
So let's go back to the real story of your book. You decided to write this book, which is memoir, it's a novel, it's a real story. You decided to write it in form of letters that you write to this man who's Count Moïse de Camondo, which is a paradox. And you tell the story of his life and of his house. The house that in the late 30s, when he dies, will become a museum, Musée Nissim de Camondo, that is dedicated to his son, Nissim de Camondo, who died during the First War as an aviator fighting for France, right?
I tell you how this happened. It was a year ago in the first lockdown. I was in my studio completely alone, no one here at all. And I was supposed to be in Paris. I was supposed to be in the Musée Nissim de Camondo because I was supposed to be doing an exhibition in that house. of my work. I was supposed to be in Paris, and I was walking around my studio, and I found myself talking aloud to Moïse de Camondo. I started just talking to him, and that started to become letters. And the great thing about letters, as you know, is that you can be cross or amused or questioning or reflective. They can be any length. In terms of tone, tonality, you can move between different moods and different possibilities. And so they became a very natural way of me asking him questions and reflecting back. He obviously doesn't write back to me, but me talking aloud to him really about things that matter, about assimilation, about why he wanted to make that house, about being a collector, which is something I care about family, about Montaigne, about essays, about porcelain, about Chardin, about Proust. And it was just a way, really, of me engaging with the strangeness, this utter strangeness of that house in the Rue de Monceau. There is the perfect house, much more beautiful than the Wallace collection. The perfect house, the memorial for his son, and the dreadful story that actually it's also a memorial, which he could not have guessed, for his children, for his daughter and his grandchildren. And so it brings up, it crystallizes, I suppose, Alain, lots of things that I find really confusing. Being a collector, how do you create a house and keep it together? How do you keep things from being diasporic? And what does memory do? All these things are real complicated, granular questions to ask. So I asked them of him through letters.
I was thinking from your letters, I don't know if he was a happy man or not, because he has been abandoned by his wife, Irene, who left him for going to stay with an Italian aristocrat and left him and the children in the big house. And he slowly gets rid of all the memories of his past, right? I mean, all objects or things that remember Istanbul or that come from his uncles or father or whatever, he tries to sell them, or he gets rid of them to make a real French house. So what was his idea? Him and the Cayen d'Anvers or the Rothschilds or the Ephrussi or Reinach, they all knew that they were not entirely accepted. From your book, from the letters to Commando, we understand that all these people created a kind of luxurious ghetto, and they knew that there was prejudice against, right?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. And so you've got this extraordinary thing where they all give incredible legacies to France. So, there's Camondo giving the house to France. There's Beatrice Ephrussi Rothschild giving her incredible villa to the Institute. There's the Villa Kerelos, the Reinach family giving their incredible villa. Everyone gives things to France to say they're grateful for having been accepted as French. And what I talk about in the book is that in some ways this is very painful, because you give very publicly all this stuff to France to say, I'm grateful. And then 10 years later, it's all held against you, because you've become very public. You've given this stuff very publicly. And then you're even more public at the moment of rupture.
You don't say in the book if these people were speaking French without an accent. I mean, if they were really well-trained, like somebody who in England would go to Oxford and assume the proper accent.
I know something about this. So I know that the Ephrussi brothers were mocked for their accents. There are contemporary descriptions by the Goncourts talk about their diction. But I know that the Reinach brothers, who are, speak perfect French, but from Alsace, there's that touch of Alsace around them. So all these markers of, how proper are you as a member of the French society? Yes, they do come back, these questions, all the time throughout their lives.
But still they want to be assimilated.
Yes.
And the Reinhardt family, they were famous because they were against Drummond and wanted to create a kind of reformed Jewish world, right?
Yes.
Which Jews were not anymore really Jewish or something like that, right? They really wanted this assimilation. And you use the word in your book, which is not used anymore. They didn't call themselves Jewish, but Israelites.
Yeah, yes. They are a fascinating family because partly their intellectual strength of mind, I mean, they're all powerful polemicists for assimilation, for this contemporary Jewish life where Jewish thought and French democratic ideals would come together. It's an extraordinary sort of utopian idea about why the French would accept contemporary Jewish life, why contemporary Jews should become French. I mean, it's a very interesting idea. They're very anti-Zionist. You know, they really want France to work for Jews and Jews to work in the public eye. I mean, there they are. I mean, I quote all the stuff during the Dreyfus affair about you know, the petitions for their appalling tortures that should happen to them.
And then there's another thing that many wealthy families did, or the most wealthy family did since a very long time before, which is weird for Jews because Jews could not paint images, right? So they couldn't portray people, but still family. Another sign of assimilation is, for instance, in this family, the Cain d'Anvers, they mixed with the Ephrussi family. They wanted to be portraited by Renoir. And some of these portraits, especially the one of Irène, Cain d'Anvers, that becomes the wife of Moïse de Camondo, became a very, very famous painting, right? It was put in Chambord during the war, then taken back, then Goering gets the painting, then they sell it. They exchange it with something else, and at the end of the day, it was sold by the last heir of the Camondo, Irène herself.
Yes.
Sort of a Swiss Nazi.
You want a film. I mean, that's the film. I mean, it really is the film. And what you've got there is an extraordinary, as you say, you go way, it goes way back to this idea. There you are, you know, Nouveau Riche, you're in Paris, and you need your ancestors. You need portraits. You need to represent your family, like all the other people who you know and respect. And so how do you do that? How do you get your ancestors on the walls? How do you get your family on the walls quickly? You know, you ask Renoir, or you ask Carolus Duran, or any of the other society portrait painters. But that particular painting is so interesting because, as you say, Irène, when you look at that painting, as the critic said at the Salon, basically, she looks like a pretty Gentile girl. You know, she doesn't look Jewish. You know, she's enchanting. And so that picture becomes a perfect Renoir picture of a little girl and desirable as a Renoir. And that passage through the war into Goering's hands and then all that kind of stuff. And then the restitution is incredibly painful. It's an incredibly painful story because it's a story where the resolution at the end of the story is so unresolved. It's not a resolution. You know, Irène survives the war, her children don't. And she sells the picture to this Nazi, the seller of Nazi armaments, you know, and there it is now dissociated from the family in a museum in Switzerland.
You write letters as a genre in your book. Without answer. You talk a lot about the house, about how Moïse de Camondo was controlling every single day, his round library to little, keeping all the tickets, the things, and from the cuisine to the horse, to the hunting, to this, to that. I mean, all his very precise manias. I think you don't really say what happened to him. You know, when Irène left him, he was rather young. He was 37, right? And he died later. So you didn't know which feelings he had and if he had other women later or fell in love.
I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. So I think what happens is he curates this house, controlling, as you say, controls it extraordinarily. And he also controls his archive. So while he's putting the house together, he collects all the bits of his life in paper that he wants to keep together. So the attics of the Musée de Camondo are absolutely stacked with ledgers and files and letters and photographs. Extraordinary. But nothing of any intimacy at all. Why? Because I think at the heart of it, I think that he spent his whole life from 1917, when Nissim is killed, in grief. I think he does not get over the death of his son. I think whether there are women or not is not the important thing. I think that the important moment of complete change in his life is hearing that his son has died. And after that moment, everything, every single fiber, everything he does goes into trying to create this perfect memorial, this everlasting, eternal, do not touch, do not change anything memorial for Nissim.
You described very well his private personality. He's eating by himself.
Yeah.
Lavish dining room facing the park. You give this sense of loneliness in the book. But we don't know, probably you don't know, if he felt, because when he dies, Hitler is already in power in Germany. There's no sense of change, fear about the future, right?
No.
When he dies.
No. By creating this perfect environment with these great gates, into the park and the great gates onto the Rue de Monceau, in some ways, he is trying to protect himself emotionally and protect this perfect memorial. And the contemporary world really does not come through that, it's a luxurious house, he loves cars and all that stuff. But actually, the sense of the complex, fissile difficulties. My God, Paris in the early 1930s. Dear God, what a mess. But that doesn't seem to intrude on his life at all.
And what is interesting is that he decides to create a museum, right? Gives it to the state. He is dead, and his daughter Beatrice and the husband Leon and the children go to the ceremony. They are very proud and happy that the house is given and also relieved from the house. Yeah. But what is interesting is that the Vichy government, the horrible police, the Nazi, they take over, for instance, number 61, the house of his uncle, but the museum was never touched.
I know.
They did horrible things, occupying the Paul Rosenberg Gallery and making it the center for anti-Semitism. And instead, they didn't touch his perfection. That is still now the same house and the same museum that we can visit. How come?
I think it's absolutely fascinating. I don't know the answer, and I suspect the answer. One conjecture is that it was all kept together because at some point there was an assumption that the house was going to become the private house of a Nazi functionary, so that they kept it all together so that Goering could move in, and that's one conjecture. The other conjecture is that everything in that house, of course, there's not a touch of Jewishness about it. You mentioned right at the beginning that he had in some way purged every element, iota, emotional connection to Constantinople and to Jewishness and to Semitic life from his collections. And so this house it's already an Aryanized house in a funny kind of way. It is so perfectly assimilated that it disappears. It doesn't need to be taken over because it is already perfectly French. That's the ironic thing about the fact that it's not broken into, looted, dispersed.
And how come these people, when he dies, and we are in, I think it's 1936, right? Then we have the period from 1936 to 1940, 41, right? 42. Why these people like his daughter, his grandchildren, and they didn't think, they thought they were safe and they didn't want to go to America or come to England.
But Alain, this is the heart of the book in some way, which is the same conversation I still have with my, in my head with my grandparents. It's like, why? Why did you think you were safe?
Some of them, like the Wildenstein or the Rothschilds, some of them went to America or to Switzerland. And what made them feel, that they shouldn't leave France?
Well, I think this is the part of the pain of this, is that with this particular family, this particular part of the family, is that I think they felt that they were protected because they'd given the house to France, the collections to France. They were protected because they'd been so generous, because they'd shown themselves to be so perfectly French, that they were untouchable. Why would you possibly touch a family that had given this extraordinary thing for the patrimony of your country? Why would you be touched?
But why in 1941 too, when Leon pretends to divorce and go to Po in the border with Spain, and she converts to Catholicism to escape. They're still in time. Why didn't he go to Spain? Why didn't she understand? If they did this, they knew.
But you have this all the time when you read these stories, when you write the stories, which is that you kind of pray that people will make the right call, that they will get their children out, that they will get the visa, that they'll go across the border, they'll go through the Pyrenees, that they'll get the boat from Lisbon, whatever. At every moment you think, why do this rather than that? I so felt this with Beatrice, riding her horse, for God's sake, in 1941 in Paris. What's she doing on a horse in the Bois de Boulogne? What on earth is she doing? Why doesn't she leave? Why in 1938? Why were they still in Vienna? Why? And it's the why question that is unanswerable. It is absolutely unanswerable. People screw up and they leave things too late.
Because at the end of the day, what you say in your book, I don't know if you sympathize or you blame, you don't make a real statement about this, right? Because to let your children go to concentration camp without thinking of sending them away, right? Pretending life is the same because a friend of yours is a friend of a horrible it's like Jean Lucher or this idea that they thought they were, above the law, right? What did you want to say? It is a lesson that whoever you are, if they punish your people, you are all punished. There's no exception.
I don't believe in lessons. I'm not didactic and I'm not moralizing here because each specific tragedy sort of holds its own place in the world, really and truly. And I'm not being didactic here. This particular story of these particular people has a shape of its own. What am I trying to say? Do I sympathize? It's all those emotions. Like you, I am intensely mystified and angry and frustrated. They think that they are safe. That's the emotion I have around my own family. Why did you think you were safe? Why on earth did you think you were safe? Why couldn't you see what was happening about you?
We interviewed recently Ronald Lauder, who is the head of the Jewish International, and he's a great fighter against anti-Semitism. And he says anti-Semitism is coming. We thought it was finished after the war, but not at all. It's coming back because there is no memory of the past, right? So young people, third generation after, and therefore again, over the world, and particularly in Europe, anti-Semitism is coming back. It is not only Muslims against Israel, but, it's a feeling in Europe and everywhere, and we have examples, we have crimes, we have all sorts of insults. And so do you think things like that could come back? Because there probably are still many Jews who want to be assimilated in one culture or another, one country or the other, right?
Speaking as someone who is profoundly assimilated, but also profoundly confused. What I suppose I deeply think and feel is that you have to be absolutely hyper-conscious of the possibility of the return of anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism is absolutely present. I think there's no question about that at all. I completely believe that. Like with the Labour Party, let me just put this in a contemporary context. How on earth can one of the two major political parties in this country be led by someone who doesn't believe that anti-Semitism is a threat and is perfectly able to dismiss and all reports of anti-Semitism. How's that possible in this country, in an assimilated, civilized country like that? Look at the public realm, look at the private realm, and look at language. Always go back to language. Go back to how people are talking about things, how they're framing the discourse around people, around Jews, around the otherness of different cultures.
In your book, you don't have any moral judgment, right? You just tell a raw story, which in itself tells what happened, right? Because the end of these people is tragic, right? In the sense that Beatrice, the only daughter of Moshe, husband Leon Reinhardt, her daughter Fanny, and her son, Bertrand, in Auschwitz or Birkenau, they all die. The original Camondo family is cancelled. So what did you try to do? You also tried to say, okay, there is a museum, but there is a story, there are people, and I will bring them back to memory.
Yeah, that's what I care about, is absolutely care about, is to make real the stories. This isn't just a kind of beautiful little visited museum in Paris. This is a story about a real family and what happened to them. And to do that, you have to try and tell a story with conviction and imagination. You have to actually inhabit the family. You have to be there with them. And so it's a kind of attempt at empathetic recreation. I'm trying to be a novelist. I'm not brave enough, Alain, like you, to be a novelist. So I'm trying to write something which has the gravity that makes you believe in them, believe that they're real people. And if you do that as letters and they don't write back, that is also a structure which I hope has resonance. I hope that has a powerful thing.
Another thing which is quite interesting in the fil rouge of your novel or book or letters, whatever you want to call it, is that even if they cancel, even Moïse, first of all, he doesn't change his name in Maurice, he keeps his name Nissim, Moïse. From what you say, they certainly are Sephardic Jews, and instead it's true that they don't go to Turkish kind of synagogue, but they choose the most sophisticated Sephardic community of these Jews from Bordeaux and Bayonne, and who is called La Synagogue de Buffon in Paris, is the equivalent of La Synagogue de la Victoire for the Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah.
And they do everything. They go there for bar mitzvahs, for marriages, for probably Passover. So they don't deny their Jewish belonging, right? They didn't convert.
They didn't convert, yeah.
They didn't dismiss their identity.
No, they didn't.
Ultimately, they wanted to be accepted as French Jews, as they are Catholic French.
Yeah, and that's what the Reinach project was all about. Acceptance on a cultural and an intellectual level, as well as a financial and social level. That full acceptance, a complete acceptance that this was possible, that this project of being Jewish and French was possible.
Français de confession mosaïque, right?
Yeah.
And it failed.
And it failed. And you find yourself telling the story. And you find yourself telling the story of what happens in 41 to 45. And you have to tell that very clinically. You have to tell that very kind of calmly, if you can, with not intruding your own emotion into that particular history. But you tell it. And then what have you got? You've got a book about a family, which you hope makes that story of that house different. Completely different. You hope that people will go there and they will not be able to go in the way that they went before. They can't just go and look at the furniture. That's my plan. They can't just go and think, what a lot of Sèvres. They have to be able to go and feel that story.
Now that you are an Anglican English gentleman, known all over the world as a famous artist, why did you write The Hair with Amber Eyes and Letters to Camondo? Because they say that a writer cannot write about something he doesn't feel or know very, very well. So is this something that since your childhood belongs to you, that you really wanted to say I am part of them. Even if I am completely different, I live in a completely different way.
Yeah, so I grow up confused. I grow up in these cathedrals, but I grew up with a father with a strong Austrian accent and a Jewish grandmother who, is Viennese to her ends of her fingers, and a great uncle in Tokyo who I know and love deeply, who lives in a room that could be on the Ringstrasse, but in the middle of Tokyo. And I'm confused. What the hell am I supposed to do? I go to Cambridge. I go to a public school. I go to Cambridge. I speak, like Prince Charles, but all that. But I'm confused, and I try and work this out. I try and work out where I belong.
You feel like a displaced person?
Yeah, I feel like a mongrel, but that's not a bad thing to be. It's just how I feel.
The difference is that you accept your condition, right? Maybe you put your dreams into something else.
You're like my psychotherapist.
But these people, they really wanted to be something else.
I know, and I feel that. You see, I feel that because I feel that's my father, you see. I feel there's my father who is completely all over the place in terms of identity, who comes here aged 10, 11 in 1939. And then he wants to become completely English. He really does. And he becomes the Dean of Canterbury. That could not be more English. And so the generations, you know this so well. The generations are different. The generations, it's not a simple, linear, one generation does this and the next generation is more assimilated and then It's not like that. It's a big mess. Things skip generations. They get unresolved. They get confused. They tumble around. And if you're a writer or an artist, you have to deal with the material you've got. And in my case, it's a muddle. So what do I do with the muddle? I make stuff and I write books.
There's one horrible event, which is the atomic bomb goes into Japan and becomes a reality, the total destruction. And in the same time, in 1948, there is the State of Israel, right? It's something that comes out after so many, which is another dream that comes to reality. And nowadays, all these Jews you're talking about who want to be French, and some wanted to be Germans, Italians. I have the same story in my family with an uncle who died the same way, because he wanted to be Italian. He was anti-Zionist and so on and so forth. Still, now there is Israel, right? Do you feel you should write a third book, maybe of an imaginary book, about what these people would have thought if they had survived and seen the existence of Israel?
I mean, there are other books. There really are other books to write. Do you have this feeling that when you finish a book and you have it in your hands and you are profoundly anxious, of course, about who's going to read it? And whether they're going to like it and whether it's going to have a readership, all that sort of stuff. And at the same time, that it's already gone. It's gone. You're already in a different place and you have to begin picking up the pieces and beginning another journey into a book. So I don't know what the next book will be, but that's an interesting idea and I'm holding you to it.
This obsession, because no work of art comes out without your, let's call them roots, right? Is it fulfilled now with these two books?
No.
You have this double personality, and with all the respect for you, take it well what I say, and we can put it off records, But I don't know if you're like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, right? Who were able to be poets and engineers and sculptors and painters and all that. But you are a complete writer and a complete artist. Right? You show in the most important museums and galleries your pottery, which is a work of art. that you have worked for years and it's still your work. And I imagine as soon as this pandemic will end, you will have other shows and other projects. I think you have a project with the Uffizi in Florence.
I wish I did. No, I wouldn't. No, nothing in Italy yet. No, nothing.
And in the same time, you are a bestseller and appreciated, critically, and also bestseller writer. How do you combine these two gifts you have?
Thank you, but
Isn't it displacing to have two different?
The thing is that both things work for me in such a deeply intertwined way, deeply, deeply intertwined way. So I really think of writing when I'm writing as a kind of making, a kind of making of something. When I'm writing, I'm also walking and writing, and it becomes a kind of facture, a kind of making. And all those pots I make, I'm trying to make a kind of poetry. There is the real connection for me in some weird bit of my brain between putting objects together, making objects together, and writing. I don't think of myself as two people or two different careers or two different parallel paths. It's one thing, and sometimes it becomes a sculpture, and sometimes it's a book, but actually it's really trying to do the same thing, trying to sort something out about myself.
Can we say that you are an artist?
Yeah, or a potter, or whatever. I don't mind.
Or a writer?
Whatever.
You don't want to have a definition?
Well, I don't want to be grand. There is nothing more god-awful than someone saying, you can't call me this, you can only call me that. I don't care, actually. I write books, I make pots and sculpture and stuff, and that's okay.
Maybe you feel well in the arts, whatever they are, because you are equally successful, right? It's not that you are a very unsuccessful writer and a very successful artist, or a very you're equally, that's why probably you make it one.
I'm certainly very, 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 very lucky to be able to sort of be present in the world with both the things I care about. And actually, this pandemic, if I can just reflect on that, has given me a lot of space, of course. It's been horrific, but actually, I've had more serious, concentrated time alone in my studio than I've had for 20 years.
And when you wrote Letters to Camondo, were you also doing your pottery?
Yeah, I was.
As you published the book, are you going to exhibit what you did, and how and when and where?
So 2 exhibitions, one at the Musée Camondo in the end of the year. And the second thing is that there's an exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York about the hair with amber eyes, using all the family collections from museums. And they're putting together an exhibition for the fall on that book as well. So there are 2 exhibitions this year.
Edmund, thank you very much for your time.
It's so nice to see you, honestly.
Interview.
And I have to say thank you so much, because I loved the last interview and I've really enjoyed this too. So thank you. All the best.
Alain Elkann interviews.